Good evening, everybody. I'm Colin Brown. I'm the chairman of the Voice of the Listener and Viewer, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Jocelyn Hay Lecture this evening. As you can probably hear from the clock in the background, we're right on time at 6 o'clock starting. Now, the VLV works to establish citizen interest in broadcasting, and we established the Jocelyn Hay Lecture a few years ago to commemorate the memory of the wonderful Jocelyn Hay, who was our founder and president and driving force for many years. And it also provides an opportunity for eminent speakers to consider the importance of quality in broadcasting. Recent lecturers have included David Putnam, Mary Baird, Claire Enders, and Professor Jane Martinson. And I'm delighted that we've got an equally eminent speaker this evening in the form of Sir Peter Bazalgette. This comes at a time when broadcasting is going through such a period of seismic change. Also very pleased to welcome Jane Martinson as our chair for this session. Jane is a former head of media at The Guardian, responsible for coverage of media in The Guardian and on the Guardian website. Since 2018, she's been the Marjorie Dean Professor of Journalism at City University. Bit of housekeeping first. If the remnants hit and we go off air, just join again using the same link and hopefully that will work. We hope you'll ask questions after Sir Peter's finished speaking and after the conversation with Jane. To ask a question, and we really encourage it, just use the Q&A box on your screen. Jane will ask as many as possible. And now over to Jane to introduce Sir Peter fully. Over to you, Jane.
Hello, and thank you very much, Colin, for that introduction. It's always a pleasure to be given the job of introducing somebody who needs absolutely no introduction, particularly to an audience like this. Sir Peter Bazalgette has been called the most influential man on television, initially for his development of reality TV and lifestyle programs, but also because of an incredible career that started as a graduate trainee at the BBC, going via one of the most successful, if controversial at times, production companies, and then ending up as executive chairman of ITV, the role he stood down from just a few days ago. He has also fitted in many non-executive roles in arts and culture and is currently co-chair of the Creative Industries Council, sitting first alongside Nadine Dorris and now Michelle Danilan, which should make for some interesting questions, I hope. But this is his first public speech since leaving ITV. Before delivering this much anticipated lecture, I'm going to remind you all again that you can send in questions and say which organisation you represent if you represent one, as we will have time at the end, although I think we need to finish by 7 at the dot. Peter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jane, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us in the Zoomosphere tonight. This lecture, which I promise will be brief, is named in honour of Jocelyn Hay, as we heard. Jocelyn campaigned successfully to keep Radio 4 a generalist network. She campaigned to prevent the privatisations of Radios 1 and 2, and for the licence fee to be kept exclusively for the BBC. One's driven to observe that Tim Davie could do with Jocelyn's determined support today. Jocelyn was the great defender of public service broadcasting. That was the verdict of no less an authority than David Attenborough. And it's PSB I'm going to talk about today, now renamed Public Service Media by Ofcom, or PSM. What, I wonder, would Jocelyn have made of connected TVs, or of Netflix, or indeed of Nadine Dorris? This is the world in which we have to consider the worth of PSM. You may think I don't need to rehearse the value of PSM to the VLV audience, except that it's crucial for all of us to make the argument strictly as it applies to our 21st century, where we are in the early years of an industrial revolution. This is the digital century, and when it comes to media, it's the internet age. So old certainties don't apply, and new realities must be addressed, and I'm not sure they always are. You'll have heard me argue before that the three lenses through which we should look at this are democracy, culture, and economy. I've seen this approach picked up more recently by the BBC, so it must be valid, mustn't it? We always knew that impartial and trusted news services are an essential ingredient of true democracy, which requires an informed citizenry. What has changed is the anarchy of the internet. All those folk who think Elvis still lives, that Paul McCartney's dead, and that the moon landings were faked, they used to be isolated and probably propping up ill-populated bars in obscurity. Now they can all find each other, bolster their mutual delusions, and win more converts, as often as not within the ranks of the US Republican Party. So we need public service news and all that it stands for far more than we ever did before. I was trained as a BBC News trainee in the 1970s. Our instructors were semi-retired journalists from the BBC World Service at Bush House, and a good number of these men in their 60s and 70s were originally Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. They profoundly understood what happens to a civil society when its institutions, such as a free press and an independent judiciary, are subverted. I often think about these men today because they would have instinctively have grasped the dangers of our online era. With all its benefits, it has also released the dark underside of human nature, the antithesis of a civil society. If politicians devoted even a fifth of the time they routinely dedicate to accusations of political bias against the BBC, Channel 4 and ITV, rather than devoting it to public affirmation of the importance of a gold standard of well-resourced, principled news, I'd feel more sanguine about PSM in general. And to those who say that younger generations rely on the wild west of YouTube and TikTok for their news, I say the argument for the existence of this gold standard is therefore even more compelling. Besides, PSM content can also be distributed on these platforms. And a recent example would be ITV's The Rundown, aimed at the grazing habits of Gen Z. And in any event, the BBC News Bulletin and website should always be there to refer to when big stories need to be verified. My last important point about PSM News is the inestimable value of BBC World Service, particularly in a time of war when we all know what the first casualty is. It really is one of those gems in our media output and one of the greatest champions of our somewhat fraying worldwide reputation. Okay, so that's the democracy bit. Now culture. I like to sum this up as programs about us, by us, for us. Our viewing is so much richer than it used to be, and the streamers, international companies largely, have hugely enhanced this. At the moment, I'm particularly enjoying The Old Man on Disney+ and Dopesick on Stars. But the 2.5 to 3 billion pounds that PSMs invest in news, documentaries, soaps, dramas, daytime strands, these are the shows which stimulate our national conversation and help define our domestic culture and values. Long may we have this system of broadcasting designed to deliver this. And then thirdly, the creative economy. Now this might have seemed a trifle novel to Jocelyn had she been with us today. But as a country, we've now said that the creative industries are one of 6 priority sectors for growth. And mark you, this matters because the sector now accounts for around 6% of the total economy, and it tends to grow much faster. That's rather more than 100 billion pounds, and it's now recovered to pretty well the same level as it was pre-COVID. In other words, it's recovered very quickly from 2020. The screen subsector itself is 1/5 of the creative sector, and the PSMs are its beating heart, not just with their production activity and their training and apprenticeship programs, but also via their stimulus to the independent production sector, to regional development and strong exports. So just to round off this part of my argument, this is how PSMs deliver for our democracy, our culture, and our economy in the 21st century. This is why we should value them just as much in the future as in the past. But we must look forward. Let's have no golden ageism here. So the PSM system is undoubtedly facing an existential threat, and it's one we've not spent nearly enough time concentrating on this year. In a nutshell, how can PSM survive in an era, a post-network era, when their TV services are mostly streamed via foreign-owned internet platforms? BBC iPlayer, All4, and the imminent ITVX all have to negotiate carriage with the likes of Amazon, Apple, Samsung and LG, as well as Sky and Virgin. These are all powerful, foreign-owned platforms who can take shares of PSM revenue and withhold PSM viewer data in the largely unregulated arena of the internet. In the digital age, if you have no data, you have no business. This is why we had a far-sighted media white paper published earlier this year, which promised an update of the prominence rules enshrined in the 2003 Communications Act. Not just prominence for PSM on home pages and a PSM button on TV remotes, why not? But also guaranteed access to the platforms and fair value for the services too. But have you seen these far-reaching proposals debated much in our media, let alone on the Clapham Omnibus? They're of existential importance to the survival of public service media, but they've been drowned out by something else also in that white paper, the privatization of Channel 4. Whatever the rights and wrongs of that idea, it's now clear it's become a damaging distraction from the thing that really matters, prominence in the internet age. So it's up to us, all of us, to make sure this legislation is still pursued by this new government in a timely manner and not held up by unholy rows about Channel 4. And this is even more pressing than some other politicians realise, because ITV needs to decide whether to apply for a new PSM licence next year to start in 2024. A difficult decision to take when you don't know what the terms are. ITV is in a stronger position than most PSMs because with its successful international production company and its robust cash flows, it can choose any number of commercial paths and partnerships. But you'd think it's in the interests of UK PLC to keep ITV in the PSM fold, continuing to deliver the public good that it excels at. There's some work to do here in Westminster, and time is short. We're told that economic growth is the #1 priority of our current government. Now, don't forget what I said earlier about the PSM's core role in the screen subsector growing fast at the moment. So the danger here is not just the loss of cultural value, but a deficit in economic growth, which the PSMs can deliver, given a level playing field. One last point about distribution. It's true that the internet is going to dominate. Just witness Sky's admirably dynamic move to Sky Glass, away from the satellite service of old. But I think we should definitely keep DTT, transmitting digital TV to our aerials free, for the foreseeable future. It's a matter of national resilience. There's a war, it won't have escaped your notice, there's a war in Europe at the moment. A key gas pipeline has already been sabotaged. Are internet cables and satellites the next target? The international infrastructure of our digital age is one of its greatest boons, but also one of its greatest vulnerabilities. It would be a foolish government indeed that surrendered an alternative information network. You only have to think of the critical messages that needed to get out during the COVID crisis to realize we should keep the DTT spectrum for the PSMs, but also as a matter of resilience. It's a valued service for many, bringing them a range of channels beyond just the PSMs. Now, just as we need to update the 2003 Comms Act, there's also a pressing need to redefine the television advertising market. According to the current definition, ITV has a 45% share of the TV advertising market, as recognised by the Competition and Markets Authority. This definition is so out of date as to be practically otiose. ITV and Channel 4 and 5 have to compete every day in the video advertising market against the likes of YouTube, Facebook and TikTok. This is our real market, and ITV's share of this market, by contrast, is just 18%. Why does this matter? It matters because it's increasingly understood that for Europe's domestic PSMs to thrive in the era of powerful international streamers, there will have to be greater cooperation or even consolidation amongst them. This is what lay behind the proposed merger of TF1 and M6 in France. That deal has now been abandoned because of all the complaints from media sales houses and others. But this reform, allowing more consolidation, it's no more than realism, and it has to come. And if we don't have a broader definition of the market, it will be stopped. My warning to regulators and legislators alike is, if you value homegrown production and content, don't tie our hands behind our back. Should anyone need persuading, let me give you, drum roll please, Kangaroo, a warning from history. In 2009, this joint streaming service, Kangaroo, between ITV Channel 4 and the BBC, was turned down by the Competition Commission. It's now cited as one of the most egregious errors by a regulator ever, where they showed they could look in the rearview mirror, but tragically, not at the road ahead. If it had been allowed, it would now be a worldwide business worth billions and a muscular rival to Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and the rest. Instead, they tied our hands behind our back. Please don't do that again. Liberalize our advertising market. There'll be howls of protest, no doubt. But if you understand where we're going, the decision has to be inevitable. Now, what would a VLV meeting be like without touching on the BBC licence fee? Like an England football defeat without a penalty shootout? Like Downing Street without an illicit drinks party? Don't worry, I'm not going on any further with those similes. I just want to say one thing about the licence fee. We could be forgiven for thinking the licence fee is the only issue that matters about the BBC. The tortuous debate seems to attract a particular sort of train spotter who revels in ever more Byzantine funding schemes, compulsory or voluntary. Okay, it must be said that to question the aggressive nature of the licence fee is legitimate. However, whether it survives beyond 2027, or is replaced by a charge added to the council tax, or comes from direct taxation, can we please hear support for hypothecated funding and not for some voluntary subscription? The fact that there is guaranteed public funding for an organisation whose remit is specifically to hold the government to account seems to me to be the most laudable expression of a liberal democracy that I can think of. Let's not throw it away. With that, let me just reiterate the question I posed at the beginning. Is public service media needed in the 21st century? I hope you feel I've answered that this evening. Yes, in the internet age, it's needed more than ever. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Baz, for that really thought-provoking lecture. There's already a couple of questions that people have asked, but I'd like to start off the proceedings, if I may. Can I ask, first of all, how hopeful are you that this new far-sighted media bill you mentioned will actually happen given the political situation? And if it does, what are the chances of it offering the support that you mentioned, whether for prominence or other things, for PSNs?
Well, once you delete Channel 4 for it, which I think they probably will, because I think it's going to be put in the too difficult box. And goodness knows they have enough things on their plate. I think it's a simpler piece of legislation. And my understanding is they are focused on it, but it's not going to get its place in the legislative programme quite as early as it would have done before the change of government. But I have a hope that it will be enacted in the first half of 23. And it's up to all of us to keep pressing government and colleagues in DCMS who well understand this, that this is something that really is, there's pressing time, time is of the essence.
And if that does happen, ITV will go ahead. The timing will be fine for the 2024 deadline that you mentioned. Having
stepped down from the board, Jane, it would be presumptuous of me to suppose to take their decision for them.
And do you think that the government, as you understand it, I don't think you've had your first meeting with Michelle de Neelan yet, have you?
No, not yet. I live in hope.
You think that they will be likely to listen about prominence and all else?
Oh no, look, it's high on the agenda of DCMS, and I've had lots of conversations with civil servants, and the new ministers understand the issue. Their challenge is to get a place in the legislative programme for it earlier rather than later.
Okay. Given what you said about consolidation, which was really interesting, and I think talks of takeovers and mergers have been going on when it comes to ITV for a start since at least as long as I've been writing about media, which is a very long time. But given that advertising is an even bigger concern in a declining economy, is the answer to US dominance a merger of some kind of the commercial channels 3, 4 and 5?
I'm not going to speculate on who might merge with whom going forward, but I'll make a prediction. If the public service broadcasters want to be around, and healthily so, in 10 years' time, and I think this applies to other European countries as well, they need not 4 or 5, but 1 or 2 champions who of course will be distributing most of their programs as a streaming service. And the key to a successful streaming service is a large enough origination budget and a large catalogue. The origination budget gets people to subscribe and the catalogue keeps them subscribing. And British domestic broadcasting and domestic broadcasting in other European countries is too fragmented at the moment. And there isn't enough cooperation. And I'm not going to speculate, I'm going to have to disappoint you, Jane, as to who might merge with whom, or who might bid for whom, or who might cooperate. But if they don't cooperate more than they currently are, they'll have a problem.
You may not want to speculate, but as I say, these rumours of takeovers, for example, and the US takeover, have been around for a long time. But given the state of sterling at the moment, any suggestion why we haven't had a takeover from one of these US companies?
Well, people have been having this conversation about ITV for about 10 years, haven't they? And I remember when Michael Grade was executive chairman and suffered the downturn in advertising in 2009, I think ITV's intraday low share price was 17.5p and probably ended the day at 21p. Nobody bought it then, and they haven't made a bid since. So I'm not quite sure it's as imminent as you say. I'll tell you one more thing that doesn't exactly fill me with delight, but I was privy to a presentation by one of our leading banks and advisors a couple of weeks ago, and they were asked in relation to a media company, you know, what's the likelihood of takeover bids with the sterling, as you say, as weak as it is, from America? And they said, right now, the reputation of Britain is not great abroad, and nobody's thinking of investing in Britain right now. I'm sorry, that's a sad thing to say about my country or to hear from a leading bank, but I'm afraid that's what I heard.
That is quite shocking. There are now quite a few questions, but I do want to ask one more, because you've finished with that passing reference to the BBC licence fee and some kind of hypotheticated tax. Do you think the existential threat that you talk about for all of PSNs that we so rely on is even greater for the BBC?
Do I think the threat from prominence, for instance, in the internet age, that sort of threat, or the threat of not being funded in the future?
The threat of not being funded.
Right.
And being able to deliver the sort of public service broadcasting that we've all come to know and rely on.
Well, I think what I was getting at earlier, and perhaps I should have spelt it out more, is that if you listened to the tenor of the debate, say, in Westminster about the BBC, you think the whole issue was about, one, about political bias, and two, about, you know, should it be a license fee or should it be a voluntary subscription? What depresses me is I don't hear politicians, when they're making those remarks, say first, I'd just like to say that the BBC is of inestimable value to UK PLC, both at home and abroad, for these reasons. And I've tried to spell some of them out tonight. And that's what, you know, you don't know what you've got till it's gone, as the song says. And I just think we need to remind our elected elders and betters that there are some really basic philosophical, civil arguments in favour of the BBC that need to be stated before you get down to the granular cut and thrust over its funding.
Thank you. Now, there are a few questions. I will pick them roughly in the order that they came. To keep sending them in. First of all, Robert Beveridge said, did the end of federal ITV and consolidation contribute to the marginalisation of non-metropolitan voices and reinforce the feelings of marginalisation in the regions? Which, of course, federal TV, that happened a long time ago, but since 2016, that argument has become even more applicable, perhaps. What do you think?
I don't think I agree with that. I think that, I mean, this is this is a point that doesn't specifically apply to ITV, although Robert named ITV in the question. You could ask this question to the BBC or indeed Channel 4. I think the trend's going the other way, actually. Channel 4 has, as you know, set up quite significant centres in Bristol and Leeds. And indeed, as they tried to stave off privatisation, they even offered to move their entire company out of London, and that may well happen. So that's a trend going in the other direction. I think that the BBC has worked very hard to develop its regional voice and a range of voices, and more recently has been having things like the Today programme come from all over the shop in all sorts of centres, and as you know, moved BBC Breakfast to Manchester, so you tend to get northern voices on breakfast television more often than before. And then where ITV is concerned, with our major production centres in Manchester and in Leeds, with our regional news, it may not be exactly how it was when there were, 11 or 12 ITV franchise companies. It's actually, if you put all that, everything I've just said and everything everybody's doing, I think on the whole, the trend, along with the commitment to spend, I don't know what it is it 40% of our production outside London, or whatever we have to commit to as PSMs? I think the trend's going the other way, actually.
There's quite a few questions about ITV, but I thought first of all I'd take a general question from Simon Aubrey, who asks, who as you know has led the way on lots of issues about diversity. He said, it's now 23 years since broadcasters announced action plans to advance diversity. Why has progress been so slow in off-screen creative roles, and what should be done now?
Yeah, I'm very pleased Simon has mentioned off-screen roles. In fact, I do a little bit of mentoring for a very good reporter who's mixed race, and he's always being offered brilliant jobs on screen, and I'm always challenging him. I won't say which broadcaster he works for. I'm always challenging him to turn them down and get himself a job, a senior management job. And it's easy, isn't it, to go to promote people on screen? But what we really need is more senior people in management, and that's one of the challenges. But if I may, Simon, I'll make a broader point. I co-chair the Creative Industries Council, as you said earlier, Jane, and we're going to bring out a sector vision, which is meant to be a policy framework for the creative industries more broadly than merely the screen industries before Christmas, I hope. And its working title is A Plan for Inclusive Growth. And that word inclusive is, I hope, will be in the title. And it's there for two reasons. One, inclusive growth in terms of regionality, but also inclusive growth in terms of diversity and access. And we should continue pressure on all the companies, and actually BBC ITV are making good progress in that respect. Maybe not as much as Simon would like to see, but they are making progress. But in addition to that, we cannot crack greater access into our industry, which claims to be the beating heart of our culture. And if it lives up to that claim, it has to it has to represent all communities and get the talent from all communities. We can't do that without better careers advice in schools. I saw a rather depressing statistic from a BFI report the other day that said it was that 41% of 16-year-olds polled did not know there was a career in the screen industries. Now, at the moment, the screen industries are growing like topsy. They have a massive skills shortage, from makeup and carpenters to real-time game engineers, renderers, sound engineers, everything. Shortage of absolutely everything. With our massive studio growth and making all the programs we're making for streamers and so on. And if we don't win the hearts and minds of teenagers and make them understand what the career paths are, have better definitions of what the jobs are, better definitions of the career paths, we'll never crack the access problem. So I'm glad you raised it, Simon, and I hope you'll look at that side of the issue. That is what you might call the supply rather than demand, as well as all the other good things you've campaigned for.
Thanks, I'd like to go, I think that leads on to another question actually from Ben Fenton at Multibox Media, which is a two-part question. He says part two, but I'm going to ask it first, which is how do we keep young people watching something that is a unified video experience, even if it isn't television as we understand it? And also, how can we define and differentiate what you might call genuine, real British television from the sort of globish US idea of what British television is? So both about youth and about distinct...
I'm less concerned. I mean, there is a definition of British television because it's how you get the tax credit, and it's how many of your where you make the show and where you post produce it and so on. But you're thinking more of the editorial content, I know. Sorry, I've gone completely blank. And having said what I've just said, just repeat the question, will you, Jane?
How do we keep young people watching something?
Yes, right, absolutely. The good old unified experience. So look, there are actually very occasionally, like the Queen's funeral or the Euro Cup final, there are audiences of over 20 million, but they're as rare as hen's teeth. The Christmas audience of Morecambe and Wise show, family viewing 24 million, that ain't going to happen in the future. But actually, audiences that you can easily get still for things like Strictly and things like Antidex Saturday Night Takeaway and so on, audiences between 5 and 10 million, actually, by comparison to any other media, Ben, are extraordinarily wide audiences where people are watching together. And even in the streaming area, you get a corporate audience, but you build it up over time. So I think you're right to say it's good to have, corporate audiences because it's like you share something. But it happens in a number of ways, and I still think, compared to any other medium, TV has got that ability to deliver and build a mass audience and a mass consciousness.
Going to sort of ITV, there's a couple of questions. Do you think, Martin Stott asks, do you think all three main TV sales houses would support your call to liberalise the TV ad market regulation?
All three media is a production company, not a sales house. I'm not quite sure what he means there, but let's take it that he means sales houses anyway. Yes, I suspect that the main sales houses, which are WPP, Omnicom, Publicis, would oppose it.
He says all three.
I see, sorry. You didn't mean all three. You meant all three of them, absolutely. Publicis, yes. Omnicom, WPP. No, I expect them to oppose it. It's as clear as, it's as plain as a pikestaff, as Lord Denning used to say, that the fair market and the market we're operating in is the video market. And so, if we don't liberalise in that way, we will be tying our hands behind our back. So we have to win those arguments.
And now about content, can I give you two questions together?
Yeah.
So Peter Gordon says ITV seems to carry a narrower range of programmes than in earlier times, a lot of soaps and talks, etc. As an ex-just chairman of ITV, do you see this as a mistake, particularly as the soap bubble, sorry for the pun, he puts, is bursting? So that's about the range of programmes as it is narrower.
Yep.
David Powell of the local TV network says, thanks for a stimulating lecture, but will there be loss-making activities such as local news that ITV would want to lose in this next round of licence renewal, which I presume you started the firing gun on, Baz, by talking about 2024.
Okay, good. Two good questions. Peter, I think, by talking about a narrower range of programming, is referring to the network output. However, what's narrow? In 1955, ITV had one channel. It now has, well, lots of channels, as you know, some of which are digital and some of which are in the subscription packages and some of which are. So there's a much wider range of programming across ITV than there ever was historically when there was just one channel. And so that would be a correct comparison to make. I think the second point I'd make, and Peter, I think you'll have to wait till, well, sometime before the end of the year when ITVX launches. But the whole point about ITVX, which is going to have, I can't remember the precise number, but it's more than 10,000 hours in its catalogue compared to whatever the hub had, which was a couple of thousand hours. There's a massive range of programming on ITVX. It's a brilliant opportunity to give people whatever they want, right across the range, with the archive of nature programs, arts programs, fresh, early commissioned factual and drama programs dropping onto it, a brilliant catalogue of programs from abroad as well. So if you're just thinking about ITV1, as I believe they're going to call it after ITVX launches, but anyway, let's say the main channel, you might have a point, but that's the wrong context, I'd argue. And then David talks about local news and loss making. Overall, probably news is loss making, though I think national news, if you look at the advertising sold around it, probably pays its way actually. And again, I can't speak for what the management of ITV are going to say after I've gone, but as far as I know, as long as they are a PSM licensee from 24 onwards, they will absolutely want to deliver our regional news programs. They're an absolute jewel in our crown. We take them very seriously. They've had a big investment in them. The quality of regional news has gone up hugely in the last few years with the advent of things like drones, and I think they call it Live 4, the little box that turns your phone into a camera. So you've got much more, outside broadcast reporting, much more beautiful packages with drones. There's younger news operatives putting out a digital version of the program. So there's all sorts of things been going on, which has shown a commitment to regional news. And I absolutely believe they want to go on doing it.
There are a couple of questions on regional news, but I just want to make sure that everyone, lots of different issues are covered. And one of the things is Emma Powell says, if ITV decided not to be a PSB, what would happen? And what would the exit look like? I suppose just ahead of that, I'd like to put in a question to say, how likely is it you think that ITV will decide not to be a PSB?
I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea.
You must have a better idea than everyone in this audience.
I can't predict how it's going to happen, and it really is up to the my successors on the board, working with the executive to decide that. But I would hope that the right legislation will be passed, that we'll know where we are, and that ITV will be able to make an application to be a PSM, a licensee for another round. But then to Emma's question, what would happen otherwise? Look, I mean, ITV, more than half of its revenues come from its international production company, ITV Studios, highly successful company with very strong production and talent in the UK, but also in America, in France, in Germany, in Italy, Australia, and so on. It's growing rapidly, so ITV has great strength there. ITV also has strength in the fact that it's got good cash flows, relatively low debt. So if it chose to step outside of being a publicly licensed PSM, there are all sorts of people, companies that it considers doing partnerships with, collaborations with. It has more options, as I think I said in my remarks earlier. It's got more options than any other broadcasting company. I'm not going to speculate specifically what they are, but you can see the picture I'm painting.
Brett Spencer says, you mentioned the missed opportunity of Kangaroo, but is ITVX just coming too late? And it arrives saddled with the perception that ITV Hub has never worked very well.
Oh, Brett, the unkindest cut of all. I think actually I've been looking at quite a lot of the streaming services recently, and I'm amazed at how clunky quite a lot of them are. I think your criticism of ITV Hub historically is a fair one, Brett, but I'm amazed at how clunky, for instance, Disney Plus is, and how it makes you watch the credits. It plays you the catch up before the next program without giving the option of missing it, as Netflix does. So I think I'd say Netflix and Amazon lead the pack on the user friendliness of their service. And ITVX, when it arrives later in the year, fully intends to be very competitive in the way it's been designed and its user interface and the software that drives it. Then your other question, part of that question, Brett, was, is it too late? No, it's not too late at all. It's not too late to, in a time of what they call the cost of living crisis, to launch a streaming service that's free and ad supported. It's very timely, not too late at all.
John Clark asks, given your laudable support for the hypotheticated license fee and the soft power importance of the World Service, how will you take these issues forward now that you are free of your executive responsibilities at ITV? Which is, I suppose, the question I was trying to get at in the intro about, are you going to use your position as co-chair, or is there some other thing that we will see Baz popping up to try to support the BBC?
Well, people have probably seen quite enough of me, but look, yes, look, I am co-chairing the Creative Industries Council. I co-chair it with the DCMS Minister, and the purpose of it is to promote the creative industries, and the government says they're a priority because they grow so fast, and they're really, the creative economy is got great potential in the next 10 years. So I am going to be taking a very keen interest in the screen industries, which are 1/5 of the whole thing. And I am going to be taking a very keen interest in things like BBC World Service, BBC because BBC's various services, but particularly the BBC abroad, because the soft power actually is something the government wants us to do more of as the creative industries. They want us, you know, the creative industries, by the way, is responsible for more than 50, in the last numbers I saw, more than 50 billion pounds of annual exports. That's goods and services in the creative industries, the subsectors, everything from fashion, video games, you know, music, advertising and marketing, and so on. It's highly significant. And where cultural output goes first, trade follows. And BBC World Service is really, really important culturally, but it's equally important commercially. So I will be taking a close interest on behalf of the creative industries in the fact that it is continued to be supported by this combination of BBC revenues and the Foreign Office.
Thanks. Greg, actually, before we go on, moving from that, are you glad that Nadine Dorries is no longer co-chair and Michelle Denilin is?
Well, I don't know Michelle yet, so I'm looking forward to meeting her. Nadine Dorries, yes, go figure.
You did mention her in that speech.
Well, she didn't seem to be universally popular in the media gulch, did she? I'll tell you what I think about her, which is maybe not the general view, but I had a couple of meetings with her. And going back to Simon Albury's question earlier, she was a passionate advocate of greater diversity and greater access to the creative industries, and absolutely had thought it through and absolutely demanded we should all do better. And I rather respected her for that. It's true she shoots from the hip frequently on Twitter, doesn't always endear herself to people, but I found her pretty smart, and I know she's controversial, and I particularly liked that aspect of her policy.
I'd like to talk about internet regulation at one point, Baz, but there's lots of questions. If you've asked more than one question, I'm going to make sure I just ask the one on your behalf. Greg Charles from the Children's Media Foundation, who talks about the Young Audience Content Funds, also says, or asks rather, should we be considering a levy on the streamers and possibly lottery funding to create a fund that can support public service content rather than the broadcasters, which you used obviously public service media. But do you think that sort of fund is, which again has been talked about for some time, is something that we should support? Well,
there wasn't there, or rather it may be still just about going. A little bit of the licence fee was siphoned off to the British Film Institute, wasn't it? About 60 million, I think, from memory, to make children's programmes. I don't know how that's gone, and I don't know if it's being persisted with. So somebody perhaps can update us with that on the stream that you're watching, Jane. Look, ideally, Greg, you get the broadcasters you license to have a series of conditions that mean they make some of these shows. That's ideally what you do. Because you can, you know, for kids programs, you could have a lobby body for documentaries and equally for other genres, and it gets a bit complicated. But I understand your concern about having a good well of homegrown kids programs, which are culturally strong and British, as well as the international ones. And I do think we should look to it. And I'd just be interested to know how that 60 million that went, or whatever, how much it was that went to BFI worked. But somebody else may know more about that than me.
Sorry, I just got another message. And sorry, Greg has just also put a thing saying that the Young Audience Fund has gone.
Okay, I see his concern.
Sorry, I've got two different streams of questions.
Yeah, but you can do it, Jane. You work at Guardian, they're brilliant.
I can't tell you how much I wish this was actually in person. But anyway, Liz A says, is the broadcasting regulator Ofcom rigorous enough in defending the UK's PSBs to current and future governments? Actually, I think there's a couple of people from Ofcom in the audience if you want to answer as well as Peter, but Peter,
yeah. Look, I think Ofcom understands the value of PSM well enough, and there are plenty of people there who do. It's difficult for a regulator. It has to regulate and it can advise, but it can't campaign. And so it has to walk a bit of a tightrope. But I think they understand the value of the setup we have. And I would hope very much that Ofcom take a broader view going forward on some of the competition issues I've mentioned, which don't come under their, not in their bailiwick, but that they quietly are talking to their fellow regulators who are in charge of such matters to say, this is how PSM can thrive in the future. So I hope very much they promote those sorts of things, as well as looking at the detail about, did the BBC deliver the right number of independent productions and productions outside London and so
on. Emma Powell has a question about content, which is interesting as well. You were responsible for shows including Big Brother, which is coming back to TV, this time to ITV. How do you think it will go down? With mental health at the forefront, do you think reality TV has had its day?
Well, reality TV is everywhere, isn't it? What Carolyn McCall's done at ITV is bring in a whole new duty of care regime, which is, I think, industry leading. And there's a duty of care committee, which various non-executive board members as well as executives sit on and report to the board regularly. And mental health is absolutely to the fore. I think it would be a pity if no such shows were made in the future because you just felt you can't do it. And so there were 2 points about it, weren't there? How would Big Brother fare? Look, it's going to be on, I think, isn't it, ITV2? So I think it'll do fine. It doesn't have to, it only has to do, what, I don't know, a third or a quarter as well as Love Island, and it'll be a hit in ITV terms and digital channel terms. So we'll see. But I do think that the duty of care regime that ITV now has is quite robust, actually.
And fit for purpose, you think it would?
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, Love Island this summer showed the audiences are still can be really huge. Did you have a part in that decision, by the way, in bringing Big Brother to ITV?
No, I mean, I was asked about it, but it's not the sort of thing the chair makes a decision on. It was entirely up to the guys doing and girls doing the commissioning. But somebody mentioned it to me, and I just said, I asked them to tell me about, which is a confidential conversation, but I asked them to tell me about, what audience they thought it would get, what sort of age group and why, and how are they going to produce it and so on. And I thought they gave a good answer.
A question from Robin Jones. Can the BBC and government only consider a BBC subscription service rather than a licence fee when DTT is switched off and all transmission is via the internet? I know you spoke in support of the DTT. Just about how likely do you think it will be to be switched off?
Well, we know various people who'd like to get their hands on the spectrum, but I think it's very unlikely to be switched off because I think it'd be an act of madness by the government to rely on the internet solely as a main, in terms of national resilience and the broadcast of publicly important messages. And then in terms of, we'll just make BBC a voluntary subscription if it's on the internet. Well, that one doesn't flow from the other. The whole point of what I said this evening was that if we get the legislation right and we guarantee prominence on these internet platforms with the right business conditions in terms of fair value, if we get that right, there's no reason on earth to make things like the BBC massively diminished or make them voluntary subscribing. Having a BBC which is funded, with hypothecated funding in whatever way it is, in a compulsory way, is like a statement of faith in your democratic system. That's how I see it.
That leads to Sylvia Harvey's question. Could you comment on the generally much larger audiences for commercial TV in the UK compared to pro rata with US audience shares, say for CBS and NBC? The BBC has even larger audiences, so the BBC has a very positive role in raising standards and popularity generally, she asks.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing to relate back to the earlier question, which sort of said the opposite, from Ben, wasn't it? Who said, oh, we'll never have mass audiences again, and how do we get people around the telly? Whereas Sylvia's arguing the opposite and saying, actually, we still have pretty big audiences. The reason that NBC and CBS and ABC have a smaller share is because America is the biggest media market on earth. And for 30 years, they've had to compete against hundreds of cable channels and now against all the streamers. And so, although they have quite successful businesses financially, they've always had smaller shares of audience than we've had in the UK, where there are, despite the plethora of media, there was never quite the same cable setup and competition. So that's the reason, and it's good.
And another question, which you may disagree with actually, is that Albie James says, can you envisage UK television reflecting the full diversity of the UK in terms of regions, nations, communities, as a result of the drive to reflect the people, all of the people, some of the time? And in this process, do we learn much more about the interests within the nation?
Well, I think TV does a pretty good job of reflecting the whole country and a range of views. There are varying debates, aren't there, about how well television news reflected the people who voted for Brexit and whether they were properly understood or represented in the referendum campaign. So there are particular issues, but generally it does. But I think the way to guarantee it continues to do so is to make progress on the thing that Simon Albury talked about earlier and that Nadine Dorris is so anxious about, which is to greatly improve the pathways into our industry from people from all sorts of communities. That's how, in the end, you get a range of views and a diversity of thought. That's what we've got to concentrate on.
Rowan, on the issue of diversity and access, Rowan Orst, I hope I've said that right, says, how does the industry retain these much needed staff, given your emphasis on access? What improvements would you recommend to working conditions to stem the rate of these workers leaving the industry?
Well, I didn't know that was a problem we had. I know it's very difficult to keep people working in sort of like IT, and I know the broadcasters, are losing a certain number of staff to higher paid jobs for the streamers, but that's a relatively small trend. I didn't know en masse. I think our employment is growing, and I think our turnover is growing of the screen industries in a whole series of ways. So I don't think we're losing people, but when you talk about the employment conditions, what can I say? I think that actually television, in my personal experience, and Rowan, you may have a different experience, in my personal experience, television is a much better place to work, a more fair place to work, a more thoughtful place to work than it ever was when I first entered it, when it was a fairly male drinking culture.
Although I'm only allowing each person to ask one question, Martin's dot is clarifying, clarifying that he meant ITV sales, Sky Media, and Channel 4 sales. Do you think they are, that his question was about whether or not they would support your call to liberalise the TV ad market?
Well, I mean, Martin, you're better at these things than me. You know your way around the industry better than I do, actually. You've been at it for so long. You can ask them. I certainly think that the head of sales at ITV, Kelly Williams, would support it. I don't know about the people who do the same job at the other channels.
There's also a question about why you didn't buy STV.
Were we meant to?
I'll
tell you what. You have to deal with Nicola first. Good luck with that one.
And we've got a few minutes left, but David Pollock has asked a very VLV question, so I thought I'd better look at that, which is, what should be the immediate priorities for VLV, the government, and what are the most effective pressure points?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm anxious, and I'm sure it will. I'm anxious, and I've had these discussions with Colin and others who lead the VLV. I'm anxious the VLV is a modern voice about the 21st century. I think there's sometimes, not just with the VLV, but with others, a sort of default position of, couldn't it be like it used to be? Well, it'll never be like it used to be, because we're in the early years, as I said earlier, of an industrial revolution, an extraordinary one. So everything's going to change. So the best thing is, what values and good things can you preserve as it changes, and go with the change? So I'm hoping very much the VLV is a voice, not just for the BBC and its funding, but more generally for the values that PSM represents, and for a healthy ecology of PSM. So that means not just the content, but the definition of the marketplace that it operates within.
And you think that sort of doing all of that together doesn't weaken the support for the BBC, particularly given the threat to the licence fee, or a hypothetical?
Support for PSM in general is support by implication for the BBC in particular.
I'm just trying to make sure that I've covered everyone that's asked questions.
We've got just 85 seconds. I'm going to a concert. Sorry, everybody, but I have to do a hard finish at 7 because I'm off to a concert, and I'll miss it if I don't leave at 7.
Well, I suppose, okay, I'll ask the last question, Peter. What are you going to do next?
I'm doing lots of things, actually. So I've mentioned co-chairing the Creative Industries Council. I'm also chairing the Royal College of Art, which, if you think graduates of that are James Dyson and Thomas Heatherwick and the like, it's sort of really interesting where creative design meets technology. There's going to be a lot of interesting development of economic and cultural value in the creative sector going forward. It's the Royal College of Art. I chair an e-commerce company on the board of a quoted company. I chair a book prize. So yeah, a range of stuff. You're
going to go back into production companies?
Oh no. I couldn't do that. No. I'm going to leave it to people who've got vigor and ideas, unlike me.
I think your speech shows you have lots of vigor and ideas, Peter. Thank you very much. I think that's probably, Colin, do you want to?
I'd just like very much to thank both you, Jane, and Baz for that. And Baz, we absolutely buy into the importance of supporting public service broadcasting or public service media more broadly. That's very much what we are about. And we're not wedded to the license fee. We are wedded to the concept of universal funding, which I think absolutely tied in with what you were saying. So thank you both very much for what has been a great evening from our point of view. Most stimulating stuff. Enjoy the concert, Baz. And just looking ahead for the VLV, our autumn conference is on the 22nd of November. And I hope as many of you as possible will join that. That will be in person, Jane, I'm happy to say. Subject to all the problems of everything else that's around at the moment, we plan to be back at the Geological Society in Piccadilly on the 22nd of November. Today's proceedings, this evening's proceedings, will be on our website for people to catch up on. So hopefully you will avail yourselves of that opportunity as well. So once again, thank you very much indeed. The clock is striking 7. It struck 6 at the start. Thanks both very much indeed, and good evening. And thank you everybody else for coming and asking such good questions. Thank you.
Thank you.